judges. My name is Jason Ancheta. English playwright William Shakespeare once asked the world, to be or not to be? That is the question. However, when it comes to things like social structures, we oftentimes think that the little guy, us, can't make the difference that we want to see in the world. But that's where we're wrong. Let's modify Shakespeare's question and ask another one. To be involved or not involved? That is the true question. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Ancheta, and I'm currently a senior within GSA. Now, I have had the privilege of researching family law throughout the past school year, and now it's time for me to share that. But before I do, I realize that when it comes to law, oftentimes we might think that when we start talking about legal topics, you might get lost in the legal jargon. But have no fear, in today's discussion, that's not the focus. Instead, the advocacy that we're trying to aim for is the fact that when we start talking about things like family law, it's the impact on society that's of the utmost importance. And it's why when we start talking about family law, we do so not to become a legal expert, but so that we can make a difference in the communities around us. And that's why I was pretty lost at first. But luckily, there's a lot of people within the community that can help me make a difference. And that's why I started off with my community mentor, which is when I started looking to specifically the faculty of Clements High School, my principal, Mr. David Yaffe, was one of the first people I turned to. Because if I'm honest with you, I was really lost on how to make sure research within this topic can make a difference within society. And that's why, when thinking about my principal, I realized, wait a second, if he's the principal of one of the most prominent high schools within Fort Bend ISD, then maybe, just maybe, he might have had experience when it comes to dealing with social issues. And that's why, when we started talking about it, he helped me narrow it down. When you start talking about family law, there's a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. And that is, number one, how does it affect families? But then number two, how do we operate within society to make a difference in the people and their lives around us? And that's why when we started looking at the research in and of itself, he helped me narrow it down to where, okay, yeah, there's a lot of complicated stuff, but at the end of the day, we need to make it to where even the simplest layperson who has no idea about law can really understand and see the impacts that this has. But then, past narrowing it down to the lay perspective, there's also the other side of the coin, which is looking at the legal perspective that's involved with this topic. And that's where I was very fortunate in meeting Mrs. Sharon Steckler. She's currently the executive director for the nonprofit legal institution known as Fort Bend Lawyers Care. And as a result, she helped me look at three specific areas of law in and of itself. First, she helped me look at marriage relationship. Second, she helped me look at divorce. But then third, she also helped me look at the evolution of family law from its conception to where we are in the status quo, in the present. What we have to realize is that when it comes to things like this, it's important to have a professional mentor involved and to help you guide it along. And that's exactly what she did with me, to where she helped me start actually putting my foot into everything that I got involved with. And that's where service learning as well as internship became one of the most crucial parts of my research. Because with Mrs. Steckler as well as Mr. Yaffe, I was able to start analyzing not just from the academic perspective, but suddenly I found myself in the trenches of looking at what exactly happens when you start working with families who are at the lowest points within their lives. Because as the University of Oxford Exeter College of Law points out, when you start having these people, relationships are a beautiful thing, but when they start going south, that can probably be one of the most painful parts of a person's life. So in doing so, I realized that sitting with clients, oftentimes when you start talking about things like divorce or custody, these are the most sensitive parts of their lives. And if you're not careful, or if you don't know what you're doing, then things can turn for a catastrophic view. And that's why when it comes to research, that's where we can put a stop to that and make sure that even though Judge Judy is probably the only view that you've had of family law so far, we can dispel that and actually make a difference with true academic knowledge and understanding for what family law entails. So yeah, Judge Judy's great, but let's start looking at the true parts of family law and see what it exactly entails. So first, we talked about the marriage relationship being the fundamental basis for all things within family law. But what exactly does that mean? Well, within law in and of itself, you have to have a lot of precedents as well as foundations. When it comes to specifically within family law, we have the marriage relationship. and that's the union between two individuals. Now, obviously, within the present, we've had a lot of changes with this, but the most important thing to remember is that with court cases like the 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges, what you find is that the definition, even as it changes, still remains the same and maintains the integrity that we've seen from the conception of family law up until where it is now. And that's why, even though we see these changes, it's important for the courts to maintain a precedent so that we can continue to have the basis by which we operate within this field of law. But then, in addition to that, oftentimes we also have the fact that it sometimes goes south. And that's what happens when we have divorce. But that's just as important because of the fact that when it goes south, the family courts know exactly what to do to make sure that when we have two parties in question, but then oftentimes the underlying third party of an offspring, then we make sure that nothing goes south when it comes to dealing with them, and that both parties have an equal say. Now, there have been various court cases throughout history, and specifically within family law history, to make sure that this has been possible. But oftentimes we forget that when we start looking past history, then we look to the present and realize that without these protections, we wouldn't be able to help these people in the same way that we do today had it not been for those precedent cases. But that's where we also look at the beauty of legal variation. Now, oftentimes throughout the United States, we think that there's a national code involved when it comes to family law, but that's simply not true. Refer up to this map and we realize that in places like the East Coast versus Louisiana, we have two separate law codes that make a difference within those areas. But the important thing to note is that those differences are reflective of the values that we have within specific regions, and at the same time, it helps us deal with law in such a way that the community wants us to. So if we look at the East Coast, we have common law. Now, for those of you that don't know, common law is what a lot of our US legal system is based upon, simply because it comes from British tradition and more Western values. But then we also have things like the Napoleonic law, which is also a Western tradition of law, but at the same time that comes to us from France. So as you can see, it's that historical precedent that we had in colonialism that oftentimes plays a big part on how those legal codes have developed. And as a result, we have the beauty of differentiation within the modern day society. Because imagine this, if you have a society in which everything was the same, then yeah, you might think it would become easier. But at the same time, we lose that legal variation that comes about because of that precedent. And then that leads us to the topic of legal realism. Now, oftentimes within modern day society, people have the common misconception that as we start looking towards law, it stays rigid and it can't be changed no matter what. But that's where fortunately, we are wrong. When we start looking towards law in and of itself and how it stands in the present, then we see that because of legal realism, because of the fact that we know that law changes and it has to adapt to the different scenarios that we deal with, that's what the legal concept of legal realism is, in that the law can change to adapt and fit the needs of the society at a given point in time. And then that's where past research, we start applying this to society. Now, within this picture, I've actually had the opportunity to go to different hearings within the Fort Bend County Law House and Courthouse, and basically what it was is that when we start going, it's important to realize that with the applications of these legal concepts, it's not so much about facts and figures on a sheet of paper. I think it's more important to focus on the fact that when you have clients who are sitting in front of you and are arguing their case in a pro se manner, which for those of you that don't know is doing it on your own without a formal attorney, then what you realize is that there's a lot of stuff that goes involved. But when we start looking past that, that's where we realize that in order to make sure that pro se litigants are able to do such a thing, then that's where we come in as a community. And that's where, when we start looking at the knowledge of looking at those, number one, the marriage relationship, number two, the divorce, but then number three, law as it changes over time, then we can help people in our lives that are going through the same thing. So as part of my research, I was able to start reaching out and communicating that research to other people within my school district. But specifically, I started planning by looking at AP Human Geography classes located at Travis High School as well as Austin High School. And as a result, I didn't think it would go as smoothly as it did, but as a result of a lot of planning and such, what we were able to do is implement things like surveys to realize that when we have the people in question, the audience that I was trying to aim towards was the students within these AP Human Geography classes. And as a result of the survey, we were able to establish a couple of things. But in doing so, I was able to adapt my research to where, okay, these kids are aware of a couple of things, so let's start looking at the things that they aren't aware of. one of those things was the fact that when we start looking at law, yes, you have the marriage relationship, and yes, you have divorce, but at the end of the day, it's all about protecting the people involved, and that was what we were able to stress throughout a lot of the presentation. So here was one of the pictures from my event in and of itself, and as a result, it went pretty well. We were able to go through a lot of classes together, and as a result, we were able to talk about these family issues that aren't given a lot of dialogue within modern day society. So if you'd like to learn more about the research that I've talked to you guys about today, please visit my website at familylawja.weebly.com. And if you do have any other questions, please let me know. Thank you.
9 minutes and 55 seconds.
Wow. Okay, Jason.